Thank you everybody for joining us this morning on Sunday, the second day of the Words Festival. It is absolutely a pleasure to have everybody here. We have an incredibly rich lineup for today that you should check out, and hopefully you'll join us for the day of events. So, we have with us today Michael Arntfield, who is a professor at Western University, where he specializes in digital and emerging media, investigative journalism, true crime writing, and forensic linguistics, lexicology, and stylometry. He has also previously served as a professor of criminology at Wilfrid Laurier University and is now affiliate faculty with the Centre for Research in Forensic Semiotics at Victoria College, Toronto. Further, he was over 15 years' experience as a police officer across myriad areas of specialization, like major crimes, robbery, arson, criminal intelligence, crime prevention, as well as writing search warrants, production orders, and other juridical authorizations. He is the perfect person to be hosting our session today, and if you want to check out his book, he has a new book out called Mad City. It's up at the bookstore as well. Thank you for joining us. Mike, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Josh. So, thanks everyone for coming today. We have two, as you probably know, that's why you're here, very venerable and widely respected authors in the area of crime here in Canada, who have been gracious enough to be here with us this morning. Ian Hamilton and John...
Venerable one.
Sorry?
The venerable one.
Venerable one. And then that would leave John Goldbach as the respected one, or yeah. Two very different styles, and we can talk more about that. They're both going to, we're going to start with a reading from each of them, select readings, and then this is supposed to be very informal. I'm going to have some very general questions for them in the realm of crime and depicting crime and their character treatments. And then I thought maybe from there we can bat around some ideas and open it up to the floor. And I'm sure people here have questions, burning questions that they are waiting to ask. So whether you're an avid reader, an aspiring writer, or just interested, as everybody is now, in crime, I think you'll find this an engaging 60 minutes or so. So with that, Ian, would you like to begin with a select reading from...
The Water Rat of One Child.
Okay.
Oh, it's on. Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you for coming. I'm going to read from the first book in the Ava Lee series, The Water Rat of One Child. The 10th was published this year, the Couturier of Milan, and the 11th, which is the Imam of Tawi Tawi, will be released this coming January. But I thought I'd read from this one. For those of you who don't know who my main character is, her name is Ava Lee. She's in her mid-30s. She's a Chinese-Canadian forensic accountant. And in this book, her career is still chasing bad debts for a living. And she's a partner in Hong Kong, an elderly Hong Konger whose name is Uncle. And Ava and Uncle are in the business of chasing bad debts but saving people's lives, because when money's stolen, lives can be destroyed and turned upside down. Anyway, I'm going to read from The Water Rat, and I'm going to read short sections. The first time in the book, you realize that Ava, even though she's 5'3" and 115 pounds, is capable of looking after herself. She's in Georgetown, Guyana. Has anyone ever been to Georgetown, Guyana? One person has. I don't recommend it for anyone else. It's a rough place. She's in Georgetown, and she decides to go for a jog. So she's going out for a run. Ava began jogging towards the Atlantic. It was close to low tide, and between the wall and the ocean was a large expanse of sandy beach. On her right was Seawall Road, which was lined with consulates and embassies. There was hardly any traffic on the road and virtually no one on the path. Ava could see perhaps 2 or 3 kilometers ahead, where a woman was on the beach tossing sticks to a dog. And further down, she could see 2 figures sitting on the seawall. She ran about a kilometer before the seated figures became distinct. They were 2 East Indian men sitting maybe 20 meters apart. As she drew near, she noticed she had attracted their attention. She thought about stopping and turning back, and then told herself she was being silly. It was the middle of the day, and they were in a wide open area. She was about 5 meters from the first man when she saw him stiffen, and her senses prickled. She sped up to get past him, and as she did, the second man jumped off the wall onto the path, and she was trapped between them. One of the men was about 5'10" and had to weigh at least 200 pounds. He wore ragged blue shorts and a t-shirt that read, "Drink Coors." The other, who was a bit taller and not much thinner, was wearing soiled jeans and a singlet that exposed his chest and armpits. Ava noticed he had only one eye. It was fixed on her, and it wasn't conveying kind intent. She stopped and turned so that she was facing the wall and had a clear view of the two of them. "This can be easy or hard. It's your choice," the one to her left said, a knife now visible in his hand. They inched towards her, trying to maintain equal distance. Ava moved left to bring her closer to the one with the knife. He waved it in the air until he was about half a meter from her. Then he reached down to grab her hair with his left hand, the knife held back, poised to strike. She retreated backwards about half a step. When he tried to close the distance, she stepped forward. Her right arm rocketed towards him with the force of a piston. The extended knuckle of her index finger crashed into the bridge of his nose. She wasn't sure what she noticed first, the crack of cartilage or the gush of blood. He sagged to the ground, dropping the knife as both hands moved to cradle his nose. She picked up the weapon and threw it over the wall. The other man hadn't moved as she put his friend out of action. Now he edged towards her, with his fists balled. She knew she could avoid his swings, but she wasn't about to give him the chance. When he was within striking range, her right arm shot out again. This time she used the base of her palm to strike at the center of his forehead. He reeled back and she leapt after him, her left fist driving into his Adam's apple. He collapsed, his eyes rolled back, and his hands clutched his throat as he gasped for air. She had known people to die from that blow. The whole incident had taken no more than 30 seconds. She looked around. There was no one in view, no cars in the road. She turned and began to jog back to the hotel, past the woman throwing sticks to a dog. "How was your run?" the doorman asked Ava when she arrived back at the Phoenix Hotel. "Okay," she said. "Thank you."
Thank you, Ian. I've got new questions already based on that reading. So before we get to that and sort of open things up, John, would you like to take the podium? And John Goldbach will now be reading from The Devil and the Detective.
Thanks for having me, by the way, and thanks for being here, and thanks to all the Words people especially. It's really nice to be here. My detective, Robert James, has pretty much zero qualifications whatsoever to be a detective. He's not an expert in crime or anything like that, but he's quirky enough to try it out. But I'll just read the first couple pages, so it won't require that much setup, because this is from the very beginning of the book. Crime is law. Law is crime. That much is obvious. Interpret it however you like, but it still holds. Enough abstraction. Time for the case. The phone call came in the late evening, and the woman on the other end of the line was crying. "Mr. James," she said. "Yes," I said. "I need your help," she said. "My husband, he's been murdered." "How did you get my number?" "Mr. Bouvert, my lawyer, he gave it to me." She started weeping. "Mr. James, please, I need your help. He's been stabbed in the chest. Gerald's been stabbed in the chest." "Calm down, ma'am. I don't even know your name." "Elaine," she said. "Elaine Andrews." Although it was late, I was awake, or somewhat awake. I'd been reading a book on the couch and drinking whiskeys. I was tired and groggy, but still awake. "Have you called the police, Mrs. Andrews? Where's your husband?" "Yes, I've called the police, and my husband's in the living room with a knife in his chest. He's soaked in blood." "When did you find him?" "Just now, when I woke up. When I saw he wasn't in bed, I called out to him, and there wasn't an answer, so I went to go look for him, and when I found him, he was downstairs in the living room, laid out on the couch, with a knife in his chest." "Where do you live?" "Tower Street, 19 Tower Street." Please, come soon. I will, Mrs. Andrews, but I'd like to ask you one more question. Yes? Why have you asked me to come so quickly? I mean, you haven't even talked to the police, or at least they haven't shown up at your home yet, so why call me immediately? I called the police first, and then my lawyer, and he told me to call a private detective. He gave me your number. He said you'd be discreet. Are there things we need to be discreet about? He just seemed to think it was a good idea. That's the doorbell, she said. Probably the police. Come soon, please. After she hung up her phone, I stood with mine in my hand, listening to the deadline. I put the phone back on its mount and sat down on the couch and drank my drink. I wasn't sure why she was calling me, a private detective, before the police, although useless for anything other than exerting unnecessary force, even had a crack at the case. Something's fishy, I thought, without a doubt. Her lawyer was overly cautious, I thought, sitting on the couch, whiskey in hand, contemplating the case. The case of Mr. Gerald Andrews. Gerald Andrews, with his wife, Elaine Andrews, and a knife in his chest. Their names were so boring, so commonplace as to seem improbable. At the very least, I thought, groggy from the drink, Mr. Gerald Andrews' death, whether caused by murder or suicide or some freak accident, would bring considerable excitement to Mrs. Elaine Andrews' life. Elaine Andrews. Who is this woman, I wondered, while sitting on the couch, shortly after she called me, shortly after the expiration of her husband, Gerald Andrews. They both had old people's names, but Elaine Andrews' voice sounded young, or at least not old. Under 40, I suspected, but I'm often wrong when it comes to guessing people's ages, especially over the telephone. There are a lot of things I get wrong when it comes to guesswork. I observe, and then I come to a conclusion, if there's a conclusion to come to, which more often than not, there isn't. A lot remains unknown. Things change while you look at them. I better get dressed, I thought, sitting on the couch, so I finished my drink and took a shower.
Thank you, John. So, two very different prose styles, obviously, two very different detectives, I would say. I guess that's my first question, and I talk to my students about this. When we look at the evolution of crime fiction, really the first police detective to receive literary treatment would be Inspector Bucket, probably in Charles Dickens' Bleak House in 1853, which is a lesser-known and cumbersome Dickens novel, but it's also a murder mystery, which marked a bit of a departure for him. But what we see then subsequently is, of course, C. Auguste Dupin, which is Poe's private detective, obviously Sherlock Holmes. And really, the genre is built on what we can loosely call the amateur detective, someone who is not, John, as you said, of your detective particularly, an expert in crime. And while Ava Lee is a sophisticated investigator and adept at deduction, she's not a cop. And I think it's interesting that this is still sort of the creative engine that drives this genre, is someone who isn't a police officer and as a result is not constrained by the police bureaucracy. Someone who is able to, John, as you mentioned in your reading, why are you calling a private detective? Well, really, I mean, if anyone was in that situation, had the means, why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you conduct a parallel investigation from someone who is, again, an outside expert? And I guess I just want to get a sense from each of you where you got the inspiration for these detectives and whether they're modeled on any existing literary detective, and why you opted for the private or non-police investigator rather than sort of a conventional cop story. Ian, maybe we'll start with you.
Well, in my case, there was no conscious thought process. And because, very truthfully, I started to write the first Ava Lee book when I was highly medicated. And
That always helped.
It was July 2009, and I was still running a business, and I wasn't writing anything. And I ended up in hospital. I had an aneurysm. I ended up in St. Michael's Hospital for a lot of surgery. And I was being taken back to my room by an orderly, and the orderly said to me, "Your room's in the old wing of the hospital, and if you see a nun, don't talk to her." And I said, "Why wouldn't I talk to the nun?" He said, "Because they're ghosts, and they only come to talk to you if they think you're going to die." And So there I was, again, totally medicated in the hospital and hearing noises and seeing shadows, and I was petrified. And I began to think about all the things I hadn't done in my life, and the top of the list was trying to write a book. And when I got home from the hospital, the second day home from the hospital, called my partner, sold my shares in my business. And the third day out of hospital, I sat down and started to write the first Ava Lee novel. And I started with a name, and the name came to me from absolutely nowhere. And I had one line in my head, and I had no plot, and I had nothing. And all of a sudden, I'm writing about a Chinese-Canadian lesbian accountant, And I don't know why. And my wife came into my office after a few days and said, what are you doing, And I said, I'm writing a book. And she says, oh, and she left. And then she came back a week later and she said, you're still writing the book? I said, yeah. And she says, what's it about? I said, a Chinese-Canadian lesbian accountant. And she said, oh, for God's sake. So that's how the Ava Lee came to be. I think it was the painkillers sort of were the inspiration.
You can take inspiration wherever you find it, right? Is the moral of that story.
Yeah.
John?
I think part of it is that, and part of accounting for the popularity of detective fiction in general, is that everybody is a detective at some point. We're born in medias res, we're born in the middle of things, and there are traffic lights and all these things we have to learn and negotiate our way through. Politics, family, love, science, all the major realms of experience we're constantly, negotiating our way through. So I think it's pretty natural. Like, parents are detectives about what their children are up to. Children are detectives about what parents do after they go to bed. And, so that was definitely part of it for me. And another was that books, all mediums can do things other mediums can't. Like film obviously has sound and image, whatever. And books are really good at mimicking consciousness and speaking directly to consciousness, especially because it takes another consciousness to make it go. Like, you're quite literally the projector. And in a lot of detective fiction, like Sherlock Holmes or even with Poirot, it's often told by another person. Like, remember, it's always Watson writing about Holmes or whatever. And in the American noir, it's often like Raven Chandler and stuff. It's this short staccato, I lit a cigarette, poisoning myself in the sun. Sentences like that. And I was thinking, like, what if you just saw the detective cogitating, ratiocinating, like you saw his thought processes? And I thought it was an opportunity for humor, but also to investigate kind of philosophical questions and the biggest mystery of all, like why do we have consciousness? And so the form and the content kind of worked nicely for me.
It's funny you mentioned Chandler's staccato style. I see that in your writing. Again, and I employ this same literary mechanism, is sort of very brief, telegraphic statements. Sort of. You mentioned Raymond Chandler, but James Elroy might be a more recent iteration of that.
I love James Elroy, and as you know, he's kind of got his two modes. He wrote books that were more not in this telegraphic style, and then with his American trilogy and stuff, The Underworld. It's just incredible.
Which I didn't like as much, quite frankly.
I didn't like as much. My favorite book of his is actually his first memoir, My Dark Places.
That's excellent.
It's unbeatable. Yeah.
For those who know who we're talking about, James Elroy, this is his LA Quartet, The Black Dahlia, LA Confidential, White Jazz, and
I'm not sure what that
Perfidia is the latest one.
It's the latest one.
But LA Confidential and Black Dahlia are his best known. His least known is an early work called The Killer on the Road, which is the most suspenseful and realistic depiction of a highway serial killer probably ever committed to writing, and I highly recommend it. So speaking of that, my writing is true crime, and I come from an honest place with respect to that, having spent 16 years subsumed day to day with criminal psychopaths for the most part. So I know that's where I gain my material. Where do both of you, from your respective backgrounds, get your ideas about the crimes that are investigated, and how do you approach I guess, sort of giving them the proper treatment. And I ask this because, and this is topical, there's a film out now, there's an author, and you will both know him. His name is actually pronounced Yu Nesba. It's Joe Nesbo, and it's The Snowman. Yeah. So at the recommendation of a Norwegian friend, this guy's Norwegian, this crime writer, I read The Snowman a year ago, which is now a film and is being absolutely lambasted by the critics and commercial audiences. But without spoiling too much, it's a serial killer who, the first snowfall every year, he builds a snowman on the lawn of his next victim, and that's essentially the portent that that person will die. That's foreshadows what will happen next. And when they do die, there's a new snowman created, and the victim's head is the top of the snowman. And this is done using a very rare agricultural tool available only in Germany that has a cauterized lasso at the end that is meant to cut things in half and then cauterize the wound. And I remember reading this and the work that went into these murders and the motive at the end, which I won't spoil for you in case you do want to go see the film or read the book. It made no sense. The motive and the method could not be reconciled. And I thought, what a great idea, but the execution failed because he just lacked the knowledge of the criminal mind. Whereas I find both of your books reflect, I guess, an awareness of criminality that you, looking at you and from your backgrounds, how did you know this? How do you know how to offer a realistic treatment of crime? Ian, let's start with you.
Certainly my first 4 books all deal with economic crime, and they're all based on true events. Okay, so I mean, everything happened that I write about. Yeah, and the numbers are real. Everything's real. I had to change names, obviously, but I was in business for many, many years, and economic crime fascinated me, because particularly in this country, you get away with it like you can't believe. This is a haven for people committing economic crimes because there's no punishment for them. And so what happens is that when the system can't deal with the theft, in this case, the victims turn to my character and her partner and say, help, because we can't get help anywhere else. And my view has always been that economic crime in its own way is as devastating or more devastating than physical crime. I mean, families are destroyed. People commit suicide. I mean, like a Bernie Madoff, the damage that guy did is unbelievable. So Ava and her partner are chasing down guys who commit real economic crimes. So the first book deals with the seafood industry. I think the second book about online gambling. And again, all the numbers are real and it really happened. And the third book's about art fraud, and the fourth book about real estate fraud. And it's just stuff that it really interested me, you know.
It's funny you mentioned that. So 2 things to come out of that. Number 1, foremost or most popular occupation among psychopaths is actually financial CEO. So when you mention economic crime, there is a connection there. I'll come back to that. John, how about, I don't want to go on too long, how about yourself?
Well, again, I'm not an expert at all, but kind of like Ian, there's systemic violence that just occurs due to living under capitalism. I don't really know how to put it, but it exists, and I'm curious about that. Then I did have to turn to some prose to read some stuff by the real police officers and stuff as well. But while doing that, though, it was kind of like a mix of reading some true crime, and James Ellroy, of course, being one of them, who's, by the way, we should probably mention, his mother was murdered. And that's how his fascination, and more than fascination, obsession, into serial killers developed. But also, though, I love like Kafka and Beckett and stuff, and they're mysteries. Gregor Samson awakes one morning after an uneasy sleep to find that he's an insect, or Joseph K. Someone must have traduced him because one morning he's arrested. And these are the first sentences of the Metamorphosis and the trial, and there's no solution to those mysteries, and it's not about that. It's more of an original sin, or whatever you want to call it. That is sort of a mystery of what it just goes. It starts and then it just goes. Like, it doesn't go back in time with Kafka or Beckett for that matter, but kind of philosophical paradoxes. These sort of things are the mysteries that help propel it. So I kind of wanted a mix of crime and that kind of metaphysical, philosophical mysteries I enjoy.
David Lynch-esque, almost surrealist, sort of inner workings of the mind that may or may not have any relationship to the actual crime.
Exactly. I mean, David Lynch, I can't say enough about him. He's a master. And even growing up, I grew up in Arva, outside the city. And to me, it looks like Blue Velvet or something like that, like this mix of 50s culture and modern time. And, it's all sort of mixed. And all the wonderful things about small towns, but also the kind of darker underbelly.
I was going to ask, what's your favorite David Lynch film? I think you just probably said it, right?
Yeah, probably Blue Velvet.
Mulholland Drive for me.
Well, actually, maybe Mulholland Drive, and the original Twin Peaks series too.
Have you seen season 3?
Yes, I have. Yeah, I was into it. I liked it a lot.
I was very into it. So, two very different sources of inspiration. Ian, what sort of where you draw your inspiration? You say it's in the old Jack Webb format on Dragnet, the names have been changed to protect the innocent, but you're drawing from actual cases. I talked to my students about this. There's actually a literary structure for that. It's called a roman à clé, a book with a key, which is, there's some very well-known, The Devil Wears Prada, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien. These are ostensibly works of fiction that are actually modeled on actual events and people, and just the names have been changed. And maybe I'll ask you now, since you told me it was all right to ask you, when you're drawing on actual cases and actual people, a word that's been thrown around in Canadian literature in particular recently is cultural appropriation. And you are, I think I'm stating the obvious, a
Champion of that, yes.
A champion. You are a white male who has depicted an Asian Canadian lesbian female, and I think have done with great reverence and realism. And there are some people who suggest that you shouldn't be allowed to do that, and I'm wondering what your response is, given your success.
Well, I was warned before the first book came out that I would be accused of cultural appropriation, being an old white guy writing about a young Chinese Canadian lesbian, and so I was I was prepared for it. It's never happened. I've never been confronted ever in a negative way. In fact, the opposite has happened. One of my biggest fan bases are Chinese Canadians. And the lesbian community has been completely, totally supportive of me. And I've been nominated for 2 Lambda Awards for the best lesbian novel of the year. And I've had all kinds of experiences which have sort of been marvelous for me. There was an occasion when I was in Whistler and I was doing an event, and there was a young Chinese woman sitting in the front row, and she stared at me for about an hour, and I was quite uncomfortable. But when the event was over, she came up to me, and she said she had driven from Seattle to see me, and that she had come out to her family 2 weeks before, and that it was reading the Ava Lee novels that had given her the courage to do it. And then she began to cry, and I began to cry. And it was so vindicating, And when I talked about how she came to me earlier, I wasn't being flippant. That's actually, the character came to me sort of fully formed. But later, when I used to give that answer, people used to say to me, well, that can't be true. A psychiatrist came up to me after an event and said, you need to change your answer, because what you've done is you're channeling stuff, right? She said, you spent all those years in business, so you're channeling all that experience. I spent 20 years traveling and working in Asia and trying to understand and get into Chinese culture. So I'm channeling all of that. I believe women should be running the world. And I have this tremendous respect for women. I've spent my entire life surrounded by nothing but strong women. And so writing about a woman for me wasn't a stretch, okay? And I've always been very liberal when it comes to sexuality. I don't care what you do with whom, right? So it was just a natural thing for me to sort of get into,
I wonder then if it's because you come by it so honestly and the people are drawn to this character that it's essentially, because it seems to be very arbitrary who is allowed to do it and who isn't. I mean, and clearly you have been vindicated, like you say. So, I mean, do you have advice for people who are struggling, who maybe have a character in mind and are struggling with whether they have the license to write them?
I think you have to write about what you want to write about. I mean, end of story. But I think you have to do it with a level of respect. Okay, like I don't write sex scenes, for example. I wouldn't go there. And I treat her sexuality as the most natural, matter-of-fact thing on earth. There's no angst, there's no drama. It's simply part of who she is, part of her life. And the lesbian community responded to that because it was respectful. And the same with the Chinese Canadian community. They think I nailed especially the family relationships and the interplay between Ava and her mother and her relatives. They think I've nailed that. And they're actually, when people meet me, they're surprised that I'm not half Chinese. And they're shocked when they find out I'm married to a French Canadian and not a Chinese woman, you know. So, but I think it's being respectful and not pretending to be something you're not. Okay. So I've never pretended to be anything but an old white guy. So it might give me a pass because of that.
So authenticity. Let's, for the aspiring writers in the audience, let's maybe turn now, John, I'm going to turn it over to you. Let's talk a little bit, and we all have great insights on this, about the commercial ins and outs of being an author in Canada. Sure. John, how, in terms of agents and publishing houses, can you just generally talk about your experience being a writer, especially a crime writer in Canada?
Yeah, well, my experience was just I wrote short stories, and I write short stories too, and I did the kind of try and get those published and got them into journals and sort of did that, and then some editors approached me because they liked the stories, and yeah, it was kind of very, very natural, old school way of doing it, just reading a lot, writing, and trying to get it out there bit by bit, and then people would start to kind of pay attention. I think it was, I'm very passionate about it, and it worked nicely. Yeah, I think submitting to literary journals is a great way to start, for sure, and read a lot. Yeah, as far as agents, I don't have an agent, but the reason I don't is because with my first book and then my second book, the agent I talked to was going to pitch it to the publishers that already wanted it, and the agent was actually super nice to me. She said, don't go with me because I'm going to take some of the money that you get anyway to go with these people. So yeah, but my editor now is Alana Wilcox at Coach House Books, who I think is just one of the best editors in the country, in North America. Yeah, which is great.
I think that's an unusual way in that you were essentially poached by, it sounds like, an acquisitions editor based on existing work, and you can just forego getting an agent to pitch then future books,
yes.
And you're, pardon the term, but in bed now with this publisher, and you have essentially an ongoing agreement. Do you have an agreement for a series of books that you have to meet, or is it just sort of as you write them?
No, that's actually why I love Coach House. My follow-up book to The Devil and the Detective, which kind of got some attention or whatever, is a book called It Is an Honest Ghost, which is 6 short stories and novella, and short story collections just don't sell as well. But artistically, it's what I was up to, and she was down. And the thing I'm working on now is a sequel to The Devil and the Detective, and it'll probably just by its nature have a larger readership. And yeah, I want to, if I write a strange play, I want to be able to at least broach the subject with my editor. And she's pretty responsive. They're very open, and they're very open to avant-garde ideas and works in general. And that means a lot to me, creatively.
And again, that's great that you're given the creative license to write what you want. And things aspiring writers or existing writers should be aware of is that if you do publish in Canada, I publish in both the US and Canada, and there's tremendous differences in that because the Canadian publish industry is so heavily subsidized, there is some greater license in terms of creating artistic works where there's not the burden of it has to sell X number of copies in order for us to keep it in print.
I've had American friends in particular who got those huge advances that you hear about, and then the books just didn't sell, and that's a kind of scary position to be in. Whereas I didn't get a huge advance or whatever, but when they do well, everybody's happy. So I don't know. Creative control is so important to me, and being able to kind of go where I'm going to go.
Absolutely. And so again, people are aware, when you get an advance on a book, this is a down payment against future royalties. It's not just a lump of money that they give you. So you never actually make money on a book until you have essentially paid off that advance, which means it needs to sell X number of copies before you're even in the black, so to speak. Ian, you got into the business, let's say you fell backwards into the business. Can you walk us through sort of how you got it into print?
Yeah, well, I finished the first. As I said, all I wanted was to prove to myself I could write a book. Okay, so I'd not even the idea of getting it published. But I finished the first book, and I gave it to my wife to read, which I was told you're not supposed to do. But people don't know my wife. She's very honest, and if she thought the book was crap, she would have told me the book was crap. But she said, it's not bad, and maybe you should think about getting it published. And then, of course, I found out that there's not a publisher in Canada who really wants to talk to a writer, right? So they want you to get an agent, because they do want the agent to screen and maybe edit. So then I found out that getting an agent's almost as hard as getting a publisher. But one of my daughters knew some people and gave me some names. So I cold called agents, and one of them answered the phone by mistake and said, what's your book about? I said, Chinese-Canadian lesbian accountant who chases bad debts for a living. And she said, oh, well, that's different. And send us your manuscript. Now, I've never taken a writing course in my life. I've never been part of a workshop, nothing, okay? So I sent in my manuscript, and it was single-spaced with no page numbers and no title. And she emailed me back, the agent, and said, could you paginate it? And I said, yeah, but what does that mean? Because I didn't know what paginate meant. And, but anyway, so that's what happened. A month later, I had a contract with the agent. 3 months later, we had 4 offers for the books. Because I wrote the first book, it kept going. So my first contract was for 4 books. And then like a year after that, I think we're now out in 30 countries. The books are out in about 30 countries. So the whole thing just went, And I'm just sitting in the basement in my pajamas every day, drinking coffee, not having a clue about how any of this is happening or working. Seriously, I had not a clue. So it was just, you have to get lucky. Timing and luck is really part of the process, I think, yeah.
Luck and who you know, as you said. I mean, and I have been aligned now. My agent's in New York, and I mean, through a series of, again, lucky coincidences, I got picked up. But the problem is, if you want to publish, like you said, an agent, you can't get in the door at a publisher without an agent, but an agent won't pick up someone who hasn't already published. So it's a bit of a catch-22 in that, and that's why I think John's experience, if publish what you can on your own to at least have some kind of literary footprint. If they Google you or they look you up, there has to be something attached to your name somewhere.
And that way they kind of know you've been working with editors, so you've been, sort of vetted, in a sense.
Yeah. So here's just how are we doing on time here, by the way? We're doing all right. I've got one last question, then maybe we'll turn it over to the audience. What are both of you reading right now? Ian, let's start with you.
I stopped reading fiction when I started writing fiction. Do you know Linwood Barclay? Have you ever heard of Linwood Barclay? He's a friend of mine. And I told Linwood I'm not reading fiction anymore. He says, that's because you're insecure. And he's right. I am insecure. And because I had my own sense of pace. I had my own voices in my head. I had my sense of timing, dialogue. I had everything going, and I was deathly afraid of getting someone else's voice in my head. So I stopped entirely reading fiction. I read nonfiction a lot, but no fiction, and I miss it because I used to read everything, but I'm not going to read it. So.
I just finished Ian's The Water Rat of Wanchai, and the first, the novella, which is the 6th book or the 7th book. 6, yeah. But it's the prequel, The Dragon Head of Hong Kong, and I love them. But I'm also reading, I just finished Thomas Mann's Dr. Faustus. I'd never read that, and I really wanted to. And it's like pushing a boulder up a hill, but it was worth it. I liked it a lot. And I have 2 other books on the go that I have with me. Alan Baggio's In Praise of Math, because I'm trying to learn a bit more about mathematics, because I was always really bad at it. And I love him. He's a great philosopher. He's a French philosopher, Alan Baggio. He's wonderful. And I'm just finishing another French writer's book, a nonfiction book, Manuel Carrère's Lives Other Than My Own. And it's fascinating. He was in Sri Lanka when the tsunami hit. And he's writing about that, but then also the death of his sister-in-law. So he's quite literally writing about lives other than his own. But it's a wonderful book, yeah.
Great, thank you. I'd like to, we've got about 10, 12 minutes left. Is there anyone who's come here today who has questions for our authors or wants to touch on anything that we brought up? Just sort of stand up and make yourself known. Yes? No, you can say it.
I was here yesterday and I was talking to Dan McIver about a book that I'm struggling with. I'm writing my mother's memoir, and I'm writing it for the same reason that you suggested, that it's just on my list of things I want to do before I die. And I'm really struggling in the sense that it's so stop and go. Like I'll write 20 or 40 or even 90 pages, and then I'll let it lie fallow for a while, and I'll go back to it and think, what were you thinking? And I'll hate it, and I'll start over again. His advice yesterday was, don't do that. Just write crap if you have to, for the sake of getting a complete draft done. And I noticed you just mentioned that you let your wife read it, and it sounded as if you only had her read it when you were completely finished.
Yes, I never share work in progress with anyone. I mean, nothing. And since I've been published, I get invited to workshops, for example, and I always piss them off because, I say, if I were you, I wouldn't belong to a workshop. Because what happens is people write 30, 50 pages of something, take it to the workshop, it gets critiqued, they go back, they rewrite it. So they end up rewriting the same 50 pages for 5 years, And my view is this: sit down and finish whatever the hell you start to write, okay? I don't care how good it is, how bad it is, you have nothing until you finish. So finish. You can always go back and rework. You can rewrite, you can do whatever you want. But I'm obsessed with just finishing. And sometimes I'm writing and I'm thinking to myself, this is crap, what I'm doing right now, right? This is crap, but I keep going, right? And then, because I start every day rewriting what I wrote the day before. I write every day, okay? But I'm always, I probably rewrite a book 10 times before I'm finished, just in going back. And then my editor gets it, and I joke that my job is to write enough that when she's finished taking out stuff, there's a book left, So I'm not interested in perfection. I'm interested in telling a story. I just want to get the story told and done, and then you can go back and fix it. So just keep going.
Words on the page. Get the words on the page, and there's a reason why editors get paid for the job they do. And very few initial drafts bear any resemblance to what's ultimately published. So, I think that's excellent advice, and I give the same advice. Anybody else? Aspiring writers or readers? Questions? Yes, ma'am.
How much research do you guys find you do while writing so that it feels authentic?
Well, my books are set all over the world, okay? But I only write about places I've actually been to, okay? And I'm writing about stuff I know, so I think all of the research for 11 books is in one Elroy notepad. But I do go back and check to make sure my memory is not faulty, because I write about real hotels, real restaurants, et cetera, and you have to be accurate, or your editors is all over you, because the editors do check, So I don't have to do a lot of research, but I do have to go back and make sure that what I remember is accurate.
Yeah, I just try and read things that are germane to the project while writing. And sometimes, like in the novella in my last book, takes place in Kenya in 2006. And, I was finding myself reading a lot of Kenyan literature while doing it. I was in Kenya in 2006, so it starts in realism and then it goes off into something else. But yeah, it's pretty organic that way. I'm just reading good East African literature while writing about a place I'd been to. So it didn't feel too hardcore. There's one historical story in my last book called Sigmund Moore, the man who brought electricity to Quebec. He's this totally forgotten figure who literally was the first guy to harness the power of Montmorency waterfalls for hydroelectric. He basically invented hydroelectricity. And he was in correspondence with Tesla and whatnot. And I couldn't find anything, at all. So I had to make a lot up. So I read books around the time, but even Dickens was in Quebec. So I was reading Dickens's account of Quebec City and things like that, just to kind of get the language and the mood right. And then yeah, it was just germane to the project, and I found it would kind of, through osmosis or something, come out. Yeah.
Ian, you mentioned the Hill Road notepad. Do either of you, and I do this, keep a notepad and write down either thoughts or, in my case, turns of phrase that I'll hear in everyday language, and I'll hear it, and I think I'll find an excuse to use that in the book. Do you do that?
Yeah, but I don't write them down, because what shocked me, because I didn't know, was that I managed to retain all this stuff. So, for example, when I'm writing a book, it's a bit of an obsession. I'm obsessive. So it's all I think about, And I go to bed and I'm rewriting what I wrote that day in my head, and I remember virtually every word. So when I get up the next morning, I look at the page, I know exactly what I'm going to change and how I'm going to change it. And I don't know why that is the way it is. But I do pick up terms of phrase. I hear little things, and I use them, One of the things I do is to help me psychologically is all of my villains are based on people I did business with and people I hate. So I describe them very accurately from a physical viewpoint, and I've got all their verbal tics down and all the things they used to say, right? And so I throw that in there, and then I do terrible things to them, and it's sort of cleansing, It's my own little form of therapy.
Names have been changed to protect not the innocent. It sounds.
I tell them that during the book. I tell them exactly what I did, who they are. But no, they don't for some reason, they don't take offense.
Like you, I do exactly what you do. If I write down terms of phrase and even a cool word or something that I'm like, oh, insalubrious, what a great word, or something. I know I'm going to use it in a funny way or whatnot. But at the same time, I remember reading this essay by Marcel Proust many years ago when I was younger, where he's saying, don't look at a beautiful sunset and try and be a journalist about it and write about the sunset. He's like, experience the sunset, and then when you sit down to write later, it'll be there for you. So a little bit of what both of you are saying, I do.
Yeah, the nuance. I mean, that's why reading. In order to write, you have to read, and I find when I'm reading, or just on location. I mean, I lived in Nashville for a year, and they called pocket change walking around money, and I wrote that down. I said, walking around money. I'm going to find an excuse to use that idiom, that turn of phrase in a book, and I have. So, I mean, that's not something I would necessarily intuitively remember. So you have to, and I don't carry this around with me, but even your phone, in the notes feature or app on your phone. I mean, I'll hear something in day-to-day language and interacting with people, or in reading something and make a note of it, and I'll come back to it. And you draw inspiration everywhere.
I have one line that I think is unique, actually, and it was from this guy I hated, and he was a cocky little Scotsman, and he was a real womanizer. And one of those guys in his 40s, still wearing ripped jeans and shit like that. And he
society wants his pants to be intact.
But he always had these nice girlfriends, and I would say, well, that new one's nice. He says, I don't do ugly. That was the phrase he used, right? So that's in the book, okay? And Ava gets her revenge on him because she ends up strapping him to a chair and taking an electric cattle prod to his testicles. And as I was writing that, I was laughing. You know?
I think that would be an excellent place to end, actually. Thank you both. John Goldbach, Ian Hamilton, people.